Now we're going to talk a bit about the situation at the home front during World War I. Suffice it to say that the United States government, the administration of Woodrow Wilson, the third and final of the Progressive era presidents, once the war was underway, the government did not take kindly to any kind of questioning or criticism of their involvement or of their actions during the war. The first years that the war was going on and America wasn't involved, you'll recall, most people had sort of an isolationist stance, and so did the government. Once everybody is engaged, or at least the government is engaged, everyone else is expected to get on board. A couple of laws were passed by Congress in 1917 and 1918. The Espionage Act, espionage, of course, meaning spying, and the Sedition Act, sedition meaning treason. Something similar had happened, about roughly 120 years earlier, during the administration of the second president, John Adams. Way back in 1798, they were called the Alien and Sedition Acts. And basically, under that previous administration back then, any sort of criticism whatsoever of the government was considered treason. That only lasted for a couple of years. World War I, you saw the same kind of thing happening. When people are on edge, when there's a certain degree of paranoia and patriotism has been put into overdrive, it becomes a dangerous time to be a dissenter. This was true in 1798, it was true in 1918, and it was true again in the early 21st century. Some of you may remember or may have heard of the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, because France didn't join the coalition led by the United States. A lot of people viewed the French all of a sudden as being treacherous and cowardly, and in Congress they would no longer have French fries, they had freedom fries. So that's the sort of thing that was going on in World War I, except kind of on steroids, because it was a lot more intense then. Under the Sedition Act, a lot of people were arrested for criticizing the government. In some ways, this sort of points up a lot of the weaker parts, the vulnerabilities, the negativity of the Progressive era. The Progressive era was a time when people were putting their trust in governments to step in, be an activist government, right? For government and their experts to make decisions. But at the same time, that meant that questioning that government in wartime became a very dicey situation. Eugene Debs, this should come as no surprise, got arrested and sent to prison for delivering an anti-war speech. Debs, of course, is the perennial candidate for the American Socialist Party for president. In his speech, he had said that the U.S. should not be involved in the war because the war was really workers from all the countries involved being sent out to fight and die at the behest of their capitalist overlords who were profiting from it. So that's not surprising that he would be arrested, considering his, many previous incarcerations. But Tom Watson is a surprise. If you'll recall our discussion of Tom Watson before, he was the guy who was a populist leader, an organizer back in the 1890s, the guy from Georgia who had tried to get black and white workers to work together, telling them that racism was a wedge that was used to divide them. And then later on, he figured out talk like that doesn't get you elected. So he switched back over to the Democratic Party and became the most racist and anti-Semitic person around. And then he got elected consistently. He got arrested during World War I. Now, why on earth would he be arrested as arch-conservative as he was? Well, he criticized the draft because he said that it violated states' rights, that the federal government shouldn't have the right to force Georgia or any other state to draft soldiers. So those are a couple of high-profile people. Other people who were arrested included J.F. Rutherford, president of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, and the entire editorial board of the Watchtower magazine for being pacifists and not supporting the war effort. Then you have the story of John White. John White was not a socialist candidate for president or the head of a religion or a congressman. John White was just a farmer who made the mistake of criticizing the U.S. government in public during the war when people were repeating some of the stories we've alluded to earlier about how horrible the Hun was, the German soldier terrorizing the countryside and doing terrible things. And John White said in public, "Gee, how is that different from what we just did in the Philippines? And how are these things that it's reported that German soldiers are doing any different from what our soldiers just did in the Philippines?" Which was a valid point, but it was a valid enough point to send him to prison for a few months. Here we see a cartoon that appeared in a newspaper at the time. The artist, I'm not sure how well you can make this out, but this is an orchestra pit, and there is Satan himself conducting the orchestra, and the instruments are cannon and etc. So there's Satan with his wand there conducting the orchestra, and down inside the pit are these four buffoonish-looking white guys who are described here as being the press, capitalists, religious leaders, and politicians. So the artist basically was saying that the press and the politicians and the religious people and etc. are leading the United States, have just led the United States into this war, and they are basically dancing to the tune of Satan by getting the U.S. involved in this massive slaughter. Well, that got him also a ticket to the Hooskow. He went to prison for that. This type of activity is what we call coercive patriotism. In other words, you'd better be patriotic or else. Particularly targeted during this time were radicals and labor leaders. Like, for example, the Wobblies, the International Workers of the World, who opposed the war. Remember, they are a global union with members in every country. They opposed the war for the same reason that Eugene Debs did. The leader of the Wobblies, Frank Little, was lynched in Montana. He was hanged from a railroad trestle, I believe. So this may all sound kind of strange to be occurring during the quote-unquote progressive era. But as I mentioned, progressives believed that the national state was the embodiment of democratic purpose. Therefore, progressives were slow to speak up in defense of people's individual expressions of freedom, and those were often suppressed. And this intensified during the war, as the war went on, and immediately after the war. Also suppressed was the influence of German immigrants in particular. German immigrants were picked on. Germany, of course, being the primary member of the Central Powers that the U.S. was fighting. Here's a cartoon showing an immigrant coming into the United States with his little valise here that says undesirable, also given away by the fact that his head is a bomb with a fuse on it. So to demonstrate just how targeted German immigrants were in the United States during World War I, just like, in 2003 you had to have freedom fries. During World War I, you couldn't have a hamburger. You had to have a Liberty sandwich. You couldn't eat sauerkraut. You had to fix yourself up some Liberty cabbage. Some cities, I think the city of Philadelphia, actually banned the playing of any German composers, which eliminates a large part of the classical music canon. They were pretty serious about this.